Hello and welcome to our morning edition of Arirang News. We begin with these stories making the headlines at this hour. U.S. President Donald Trump says he's extending the ceasefire with Iran with no set due date, while awaiting a proposal from Tehran. The White House has put Vice President J.D. Vance's planned trip to Pakistan for a second round of truce talks with Iran on hold. Iran has pulled out of peace talks with the U.S. in Islamabad, accusing Washington of violating prior commitments. According to a local news agency, the decision was conveyed to the U.S. through mediator Pakistan. South Korea's President Lee Jae-myung has arrived in Vietnam after wrapping up his trip to India. He's scheduled to meet with Vietnam's top leader To Lam later today for talks on cooperation focusing on energy supply and trade. With around a day left till the deadline of the original two-week ceasefire deal, Washington has extended the timeline with no set due date. Trump stated that he will be waiting for a unified proposal from Iran. Kim Jun-ho starts us off.
U.S. President Donald Trump has announced an open-ended extension of the temporary ceasefire with Iran. This comes just one day before the original two-week truce was set to expire. In a Truth Social post on Wednesday, Trump stated that the military action will be put on hold as the government of Iran is seriously fractured. But he said the U.S. blockade of Iranian ports would remain in place until Tehran presents a unified proposal within the leadership. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif thanked Trump after he announced the indefinite extension of the ceasefire with Iran. Sharif expressed an appreciation for Washington's willingness to give diplomatic efforts a chance to advance. The extension comes despite Trump's earlier warnings that hostilities could resume if Tehran failed to engage constructively before the original deadline on the evening of April 22nd. He had previously claimed that he was reluctant to prolong the ceasefire, but ultimately reversed course as the expiration approached. Meanwhile, the White House confirmed to reporters that U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance will no longer be traveling to Pakistan. He had been due to arrive there on Wednesday for planned peace talks. The trip, which would have marked his second visit of Islamabad this month, had been aiming at finalizing a potential agreement with Iranian officials. Kim Jun-ho, Arirang News.
Iran has pulled out of planned ceasefire and peace talks with the United States in Islamabad, accusing Washington of violating prior commitments and undermining negotiations from the outset. Tehran is also warning of possible military action if a U.S. naval blockade continues, while escalating the dispute at the United Nations over what it calls an unlawful seizure of an Iranian-flagged vessel. Our Lee Soo-jin has more.
Iran has decided not to participate in a second round of ceasefire and peace talks with the United States scheduled for Tuesday in Islamabad. According to Iran's semi-official Tasnim news agency on Tuesday, the decision was conveyed to Washington through mediator Pakistan, dealing a setback to ongoing diplomatic efforts. Tasnim reports that Tehran had initially agreed to negotiations under a U.S.-accepted 10-point framework following Pakistan's mediation and a U.S. request for a ceasefire. However, Iran now accuses Washington of failing to uphold its commitments almost immediately after the agreement, citing that as the primary reason for pulling out. Tasnim added that a hostile U.S. response over reopening the Strait of Hormuz further influenced Tehran's decision. The agency said Iran now sees continued negotiations as futile, with little prospect of reaching a meaningful agreement under current conditions. Iran is also questioning the intent behind U.S. President Donald Trump's latest announcement of a ceasefire extension, warning it could respond militarily if Washington maintains its naval blockade. State media reports Tehran will not recognize the extension and will act based on its national interests. Officials warn that as long as the blockade remains in place, Iran will not reopen the Strait of Hormuz and could use force if necessary to break it. Meanwhile, Iran is taking the dispute to the international stage. The Iranian mission to the United Nations has sent a letter calling on the UN and the Security Council to issue what it described as a firm and unequivocal condemnation of the U.S. decision to attack and seize an Iranian-flagged cargo ship. In a statement posted on X, the mission said the incident constitutes a grave breach of international law a clear violation of the ceasefire and an act of aggression bearing what it called the hallmarks of piracy. It warned that such actions endanger international navigation and undermine maritime safety and security. 이수진, Arirang News.
So U.S. President Donald Trump has extended the ceasefire with Iran, initially set to expire on Wednesday, saying it would continue until Iran's leaders and representatives submit a unified proposal to end the war. For more, we're joined today by Professor Hassan Khan, visiting professor at Hungary University of Foreign Studies. Professor Khan, thanks for coming on today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance's trip to Pakistan is on hold right now. Where is this war heading?
Actually, I think this war is moving towards a very prolonged negotiation under pressure, not toward a clean peace and not yet back to a full escalation. President Trump has extended the ceasefire after a Pakistani request, as we all know about that. At the same time, he's keeping the U.S. blockade on Iranian ports on place. So it's still unclear whether Iran or even Israel will fully accept this extension. So J.D. Vance had not yet left for Pakistan. And so that tells us that diplomacy is still open, but it's very fragile and incomplete, and not yet mutually trusted. So where is this headed? I would say it's likely toward a very messy intermediate phase, temporary ceasefire, continued coercion, and repeated attempts to test whether talks can produce a narrow framework, or to put it in a nutshell, this is not a peace process in the classic sense. It's a bargaining process in which Washington is trying to impose military leverage on this negotiation. So while Tehran is trying not to negotiate from visible weakness to appear weak while they are negotiating. So that combination can keep war contained for a while, but it's very unstable. The truce would be very shaky.
I see. And some analysts say that for Iranian officials, attending these peace talks under a U.S. naval blockade would be seen as a sign of weakness. So what's your take on Iran's position?
I think that assessment is basically very correct. Iran is not rejecting diplomacy in principle. It's rejecting diplomacy under humiliation or pressure. Tehran could still attend talks in Pakistan, but only if Washington abandons what Iranian officials call it policy of pressure and threat. So Iran wants to blockade this American blockade lifted and wants the Iranian flagged ship Tosca and its crew to be released first. So from Tehran's perspective, appearing at talks while the blockade continues would look like accepting negotiations on American terms. So that matters politically inside Iran. They have a civilization face to save. Iranian leaders need to preserve some image of resistance, and especially after weeks of war and under ceasefire, they believe the U.S. has already complicated with new pressure. So I understand Iranian opinion about that.
Right. So far, the United States and Iran still appear to be far from reaching a deal. What would a realistic end to this war look like?
A realistic end would probably not be a grand final bargain. As you know, President Trump likes to drop big bombs, whether it's real bombs or diplomatic bombs. He wants to achieve a big score victory. But it would be a phased and limited settlement. The two sides remain far apart on the biggest issues. Iran wants recognition of its authority on the Strait of Hormuz, and they want compensation for war damage, the right to continue uranium enrichment. The United States, by contrast, wants unrestricted shipping through Hormuz, rejects Iranian enrichment, and wants Iran missile capabilities to be sharply reduced. Iran also wants U.S. combat force reduced in the region, while Trump has said military assets will remain until a deal is reached. So they are far apart from each other. So the most realistic outcome would not be total reconciliation. It is something narrower, like a durable ceasefire, partial de-escalation in Hormuz, framework of more talks, and possibly interim nuclear arrangement that freezes the most dangerous elements of without solving this whole nuclear deal. So that kind of outcome would not end hostility between the two countries, but it could lower the risk of another immediate military confrontation. Right now, that is much more realistic than a comprehensive peace agreement.
I see. And Professor Gunn, before I let you go, turning to Israel and Lebanon, the United States says will host a second round of ambassador-level talks on Thursday. And this follows last week's first direct diplomatic meeting between these two countries in decades. How might the meeting unfold this week?
I would expect the meeting to be just practical, cautious, and limited in ambition. The second round will take place at the U.S. State Department on Thursday, after Marco Rubio hosted the first direct Israel-Lebanon talks in decades in April 14th. So this new round comes just after 10 days ceasefire took place. So immediate goal is likely to be just crisis management, preventing the truce from collapsing. So clarifying the red lines and testing whether the parties, these two parties, Israel and Lebanon, can move from the battlefield to a diplomatic field. But the talks will unfold under very difficult conditions. As we all know, Hezbollah has fired rockets and drones into northern Israel this week, accusing Israel of violation of the ceasefire, while Israel also says Hezbollah violated the truce. So at the same time, Israel forces remain deployed inside Lebanon for like 10 kilometers, and they call it a buffer zone. If you know, Israel has already tried to occupy southern Lebanon 6 times in the past 50 years. So it's not the first time, it will not be the last time. So that means the diplomacy is happening while the military dispute is still active. So the likely result of this meeting is not historic breakthrough. More likely it's some steps, efforts to preserve ceasefire, manage violations, define agendas for more talks. So deeper dispute is still unresolved. Lebanon side is focused on Israel withdrawal and restoring full sovereignty on southern Lebanon, but Israel focused on disarmament, fully disarmament of Hezbollah, whether it is military or diplomatically. So I think as long as those objectives are still far apart, Washington rule will be less about imposing final agreement and more about stopping another war, another regional war.
Right, I guess we'll have to see how that meeting plays out this week. All right, Professor Gunn, thank you so much for coming on today. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And here in South Korea, the country has been responding in various measures to the ongoing situation in the Middle East. Though the ruling and main opposition parties maintain their rhetoric, lawmakers show consensus in supporting the public through the prolonging difficulties. Our political correspondent An Sung-jin sat down with floor leaders of the Foreign Affairs Committee at the National Assembly.
Nearly 2 months into the ongoing crisis in the Middle East, the ripple effects are being felt far beyond the region. In Korea, the prolonged instability has begun to impact the economy and a wide range of industries. I sat down with the ruling and opposition party floor leaders of the Foreign Affairs and Unification Committee to gain deeper insight into how the situation is unfolding and what policy measures are now being considered. One key priority emphasized by both sides is mitigating the economic shock. Alongside stabilizing crude oil supply chains, there has been a strong push to broaden import channels and over the long term accelerate Korea's transition toward renewable energy.
So when we combine those policy measures, in addition to the diversification and the energy safe measures, or we can kind of survive this period of difficulties, and then we can shoot it back to the normal economic situation.
Support for the energy sector has also been reinforced through the supplementary budget. Measures are aimed not only at small business owners and the self-employed, but also at industries directly affected by the crisis, including transportation and naphtha-based sectors.
Right, so as a member of the National Assembly Foreign Affairs and Unification Committee, if the situation in the Middle East prolongs, what are some policy support measures that the National Assembly could be providing to the public?
Broader livelihood support is also intended to help stimulate domestic consumption. But in the long term, as an export-focused nation, we are a highly energy-dependent economy, so we eventually have to accelerate the transition to renewable energy and the transformation into an electricity-driven nation. I believe that structuring legislation and policy is absolutely necessary.
On the diplomatic front, lawmakers from both parties underscored the importance of multilateral engagement. The Foreign Affairs and Unification Committee has maintained ongoing communication with Gulf states, including meetings with their ambassadors, while also continuing dialogue with both Iran and Israel.
Our greatest strength is maintaining good relations and leveraging these strengths to ensure that our diplomatic capabilities secure the safety of our expatriates, trade, and most importantly, national interests.
But they also stressed that the cornerstone of Korea's response remains its alliance with the United States.
So even though under President Trump, we must try to strengthen our alliance with the United States, at the same time, we must try to have more flexibility or more strategic flexibility in preparation for a new world.
Despite the evolving and uncertain nature of the Middle East crisis, the National Assembly says it will continue to closely monitor its impact on livelihoods and prepare responsive measures in step with changing conditions. An Sung-jin, Arirang News.
President Lee Jae-myung, straight after his visit to India, has arrived in Vietnam. He will be sitting down with the nation's top leader To Lam today to discuss key cooperation centered on energy supply and trade. Our Blue House correspondent Yoon Jung-min files this report from Hanoi.
The South Korean president has touched down in Hanoi for his state visit, having wrapped up his trip to New Delhi. President Lee Jae-myung will meet To Lam, Vietnam's top leader and general secretary of the Communist Party. It will be their second engagement in about 8 months, following To Lam's state visit to Korea last August. The summit will include an exchange of documents, a joint press conference, and a state dinner. High on the agenda is cooperation in trade, nuclear energy, supply chains, and critical minerals. The two countries plan to increase bilateral trade to $150 billion a year by 2030.
Amid growing global uncertainties, we will strengthen communication to establish an economic and security partnership, including stable energy, supply chains, and critical mineral cooperation.
Science cooperation, cultural and people-to-people exchanges are also on the agenda. During his stay, the South Korean leader will meet Vietnamese Prime Minister Lee Min-hung and National Assembly Chairman Chen Tai-man, ranked number 2 and number 3 respectively in the country's power structure. A business forum is also scheduled.
Diplomatic officials say the president's trip to this fast-growing nation carries significance as South Korea explores opportunities to expand its diplomatic horizon at a crucial time in geopolitics. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News, Hanoi.
On the economic front, South Korea's producer prices rose at their fastest pace in about 4 years in March, driven by higher global oil costs amid the Middle East conflict. According to the Bank of Korea this morning, the producer price index rose 1.6% on month to 125.24, the sharpest increase since April 2022. On a yearly basis, prices climbed 4.1%, the fastest since February 2023. The surge was led by industrial goods, with coal and petroleum products jumping 31.9% and chemical products rising 6.7%. Producer prices are seen as a key indicator of inflation.
Good morning, I'm Chu Ji-hyun, and this is The World Now. In the U.S., President Trump's pick for the next head of Federal Reserve, Kevin Warsh, told the Senate Banking Committee on Tuesday that he made absolutely no promises to President Trump about cutting interest rates. Warsh pushed back directly against Trump's own repeated public statements that his Fed nominee will deliver lower rates once confirmed. Kevin Warsh has been picked to replace Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell when his term ends on May 15th. He called monetary policy independence essential, but refused to say whether he would cut rates now, whether Trump lost the 2020 election, or whether Trump's tariffs were fueling inflation. He also declined to detail what he plans to do with more than $100 million of personal assets that he has pledged to sell if confirmed. The path to confirmation remains unclear. Republican Senator Thom Tillis announced he will block the confirmation entirely until the Trump administration drops his criminal probe of Powell, a move that could leave Powell in place past his May 15th end date. The European Court of Justice ruled on Tuesday that Hungary broke EU law by blocking its citizens from accessing LGBTQ content, finding that the restrictions actively pushed gay and transgender people to the margins of society. The ruling lands just days after pro-EU reformist Peter Magyar ended Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán's 16-year grip on power in a landslide election victory. Orbán's still caretaker prime minister fired back on social media, vowing never to give up the fight for the soul of Europe. Officials in Mexico said on Tuesday that security for the upcoming FIFA World Cup is, quote, guaranteed after a gunman opened fire on tourists at the Teotihuacan pyramids the day before. Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum called for stricter gun controls at tourist sites ahead of World Cup games in June. Millions of visitors are expected to attend the tournament, which is being co-hosted with the USA and Canada. Authorities say the shooter had planned the attack with multiple advance visits to the site and had carefully mapped out the attack, which killed one Canadian woman and wounded 13 people, including 6 Americans and a 6-year-old child. The Iran war is now hitting one of the world's most essential health products. The world's largest condom maker, Malaysia's Carex, announced Tuesday it will raise prices by 20 to 30% as the conflict disrupts the supply of synthetic rubber, packaging materials, and lubricants from the Middle East. The company's CEO said demand has surged 30% this year, while global stockpiles have dropped sharply, with shipments to Europe and the United States now taking nearly twice as long to arrive as before the war. Carex produces over 5 billion condoms annually.
Yesterday's yellow dust was intense, and some of that impact stays with us today. Well, conditions will not be quite as harsh as yesterday, but leftover dust in the atmosphere means air quality across much of the country will remain bad all day today. Meanwhile, rain is on the way for the south coast and Jeju Island. Showers, in fact, have already started on Jeju and in the Jeollado provinces this morning and will continue into tomorrow with 5 to 20 millimeters in the forecast for much of the south coast. Meanwhile, Jeju Island may pick up to 80 millimeters of heavy rainfall. And temperatures will gradually rise heading into the weekend, while morning temperatures will stay near the norms, which means leading to wide gaps in readings. Be sure to dress in layers. And this afternoon, central regions will notice a rise in highs, but southern provinces will be much cooler with rain and cloudy skies. Seoul will be getting up to 19 degrees Celsius, Gwangju getting up to 15 degrees, which is about 10 degrees lower than yesterday. Meanwhile, those in the southern regions, make sure to keep an umbrella handy.
That's all we have for this morning. Arirang News will be back at noon Korea time. Thanks for watching.